All right, folks, the time has come to start actually modeling this car in Moto, and Moto is a fantastic modeling environment. This should be really fun. This is probably what Moto does best, to be honest. So this should be a good time. Now I'm going to head up to the items list here, and let's make sure that we have a mesh item selected and active. Now a mesh item is essentially like a layer or a node. It is something that contains geometry. It is nothing in itself. It's just a way of storing our geometry and keeping track of it as we work. So let's go to the toolbar over here. We have a cylinder tool. And I'm going to rotate the view so we're looking sort of from the side for a moment here. And drag in the viewport to start creating our cylinder. Now notice something about this. It's actually drawn the cylinder on the white dynamic work plane. Let's hit undo, rotate our view, and notice that dynamic work plane changes based on our current view orientation. As I drag here, now it's going to create it on that plane, or if I rotate so we're looking down and our work plane looks down, then if I drag, of course, it's going to create it on that axis. So the tools are all going to respond differently depending on our current view orientation. So pay attention to that. Now I'm going to look mostly from the front here. Drag out a circle that is roughly the shape of our object. Let's go to the front view, and I'm just going to drag this so that it roughly mimics the shape of this sort of fuselage here, and we can use the handles. They're fairly self-explanatory. And we'll go now to perspective again. There is a blue cube in the center of this. If I drag that, that's going to pull this thing out into 3D space. Let's go to the right view now. And I'm just going to drag those blue cubes until we're matching up with the front and back of the underlying image. Go back to perspective mode. And now we have a completed cylinder. But before we drop the tool, I want you to look over here and notice that our position, radius, side, segments, all of these settings are available to us, and we can change those on the fly. Specifically, I want to look at the position on the X. Because this is going to be a symmetrical object across the X-axis, we need to make sure that our cylinder is at exactly 0 on the X. We can do that by typing 0 and hitting Enter, and that will do the trick. Once that is centered, we can then hit Escape to drop the tool, and we're all done. With that, we are ready to start into some more complex modeling. But before we do that, I want you to actually spend some time practicing. So let's go to a new document. And if you've never used Moto before, it's important to spend time practicing using the tools because there are some unusual things about them. Let's head to our cylinder tool again. Drag out a cylinder just like we just did. And of course, you've noticed that we can make changes to the properties and see those changes take place in real time as long as the tool is running. We'll come back to that. Now I'm going to select the position X, hit 0, and then hit the Tab key and hit 0, and the Tab key and hit 0, and Enter. So that's one way you could change all those to be all the same. So practice that. I'm going to undo all of that. So select X, 0, Tab, 0, Tab, 0, Enter. That is a perfectly reasonable way to do this. But let's do this another way. This time, instead of just typing 0 up top, let's head over to the right and notice these little circles. These circles are for performing gang edits. That is, for making changes to X, Y, and Z all at the same time using an equal or proportional relationship. So click this circle one time, and we'll get an equal sign. By the way, if you click it twice, it's going to give you a proportional sign. Click it again, it's going to give you an additive sign, and again, we'll turn off gang edits. If you miss and you get the wrong one, just keep on going around the horn until you get around to the equal sign. Hit 0, Enter, and that will do all 3 axes at once for you, which is kind of nice. So let's start over and run the cylinder tool again. I'll drag out, and again, let's set this to 0. I'm going to click equals here, set the X to 0. That'll set all 3 values to 0 for us all at once. And let's change some of the radius values. Now we could do that by typing values here, of course. We could set one of them to 1 meter, Enter. We can set them to inch values if we prefer. I could set this to, 60 IN and hit Enter. That will convert it to meters for me. We can set this to math. We can set this to 1 plus 2, and that'll give us 3 meters. So there are lots of options for how to enter these. These are very powerful little text fields. You can type pretty much anything into them, and they're very intelligent. Now, if I want to make a change to one interactively, over on the far right, we have what's called a mini slider. That is this little arrow pointing left and right. If I drag that left and right, notice that that is changing the length of this interactively, and you'll see that the value is updating accordingly. Now let's go back to gang edits for a second. We've already learned that if we click this once, we get an equal sign, and whatever we do to the x value will happen to all 3 of these at the same time, and it will be equal. But if we click it again, that will give us a little infinity sign. That is a proportional edit. So if I make a change to one of these, the others will update proportionally. So if I want to make this half as big as it currently is, I'll set this to 0.5 meters, hit enter. And notice that the length has changed as well, so that all 3 of these are now half of what they previously were. So this is actually a really powerful tool as well. And I'll hit escape to drop the tool, and we're done. Now here's something else about primitives in Modo. You can't change them once you've committed your primitive, okay? These primitives are not features that can then be edited later on. Modo is what's known as a destructive modeling environment. That is, once we commit a tool, the deed is done. You can't change it except to go back and manually make the changes that you need. So if I want to change the size of this cylinder now, the only way to do that is to hit R for scale and scale it. Now, of course, we do have some very fancy scaling tools, especially under the snaps and precision dialog. We have the ability to do absolute scale, scale absolute, size absolute. These are all very powerful tools that do very interesting things. But you'll never get back those tool properties the way that they were before. So make sure you get them the way that you want them to start with. Now I'm going to select this geometry and delete it. Let's run our cylinder tool again, and instead of clicking in the viewport to interactively create it, I want you to notice that I can actually set the settings here. Let's set a 500 millimeter by 500 millimeter by 1 meter cylinder. Click Apply at the bottom, and that will create the cylinder for us without any interaction whatsoever. But notice I don't get the opportunity to edit these properties. Okay, there are no handles out here, and if I change, say, the position value to 1 meter, nothing changes, but if I click Apply, it's going to create a new one at 1 meter. Okay, so if you're working this way, there's no interactivity at all. You just click Apply, and it adds the thing. Or if you run it interactively, then you run it interactively. It's kind of an either-or proposition. Now, something else about these, as you're working, if you are creating an interactive primitive, if you hold the Control key while you drag, that's going to create a unit primitive on the fly. That is 1 meter by 1 meter by 1 meter. Or, as you drag, it's of course going to scale that up and down. So I can grab a sphere, Control drag to create that, or a cube, Control drag to create that. Now, with direction-specific primitives like the cone or the cylinder, it's going to point those in the direction of the current work plane. So if you notice, as I rotate my view so that the dynamic work plane is now on the top view, if I Control drag, our cylinder, or our cone, is going to be pointing straight up. Whereas, if I do it with the work plane pointing forward, Control drag, now my cone is pointing forward. So this is a really useful way to create primitives really quickly. I definitely recommend remembering holding that Control key while you make edits. Another thing about primitives is that just like all other tools in Modo, if you hold the Shift key and then drag, that's going to reactivate the tool from scratch. So I don't actually have to hit Escape to drop the tool, then head over and click Cone again, and then drag it out. I can actually do this while the tool is running. Just hold Shift and then drag to start my next one. I'll hold Shift and Control at the same time, and then I can create lots of these really quickly. As I rotate my view, I'm just throwing these out here one after another really, really fast. Okay, so you can imagine you can create these really quickly. I definitely recommend spending some time playing just with these primitive tools. Look at the different options available in the tool options. Try to understand what those do and get a feel for it. Now, one last thing. We are currently working entirely in a single mesh item. And you may have noticed in an earlier tutorial, we did something a little bit different. We held the Shift key, and we came up and we clicked on a primitive to create a unit primitive. Once you commit that, you'll notice that our sphere has been created, but everything else becomes wireframe, and you can no longer select the polygons in them. That's because holding Shift and creating a primitive will create a separate mesh item for that primitive. Look in our items list. See, we have mesh that contains all the stuff we've been creating interactively. And then we have the sphere item as well. Now, the sphere item is nothing special. It's just a mesh item. So we can come in here and then start creating more primitives inside of that. So it's just a layer. It's not a feature. It can't be edited. All of the geometry in here is just dumb geometry. It's just polygons in a bucket called a mesh item. So you can create as many of those as you like. Now, if you want to consolidate your mesh items, you can just take the polys that you want, select them, Control X to cut them, head to the mesh you want, Control V to paste them, and there you go. Everything is now in one big mesh. So now spend some time practicing with those primitive tools. Make sure that you really understand them, you feel comfortable with them before you move on. When you come back, we'll be working on the car again, and we're going to learn some more advanced modeling techniques that Moto has to offer, okay? Stay tuned. Talk to you soon.